speaking to him throughout the day here on Al Jazeera. We're hoping to get him back on the news grid in a short while to find out the latest about the situation in eastern Aleppo. But joining us now on the news grid is Andreas Krieg, who's an assistant professor at the Defence Studies Department at King's College in London. He is in Doha, luckily for us. Thank you so much for being with us, Andreas. This ceasefire is clearly collapsing. No evacuations are happening so far. This deal between Turkey and the Russians doesn't seem to have worked. What happens now, in your view?
Big question. Overall, we have to look at it as a counterinsurgency strategy that the Syrians have learned from Hafez al-Assad in the 1982, that the Russians have already applied in Chechnya. It is basically you encircle a place, you smoke it out, and it's a strategy of annihilation. So it's quite logical in their mind, obviously completely disregarding international law and ethics, that you would smoke that place out and kill every single one who's left, as far as that is possible.
Right.
So the peace deal that they had yesterday, or the ceasefire deal that they agreed on yesterday, was something that the Iranians blocked, because they said, why should we let these people go, particularly when some of them are still armed? They will regroup and attack us again. Let's make sure we really get rid of any sort of dissidents and revolutionary oppositional movements in that area in Aleppo, and then really cleanse it once and for all.
Different players involved here, as you've mentioned yourself. You've got Iran, you've got Turkey, you've got the Syrian government, you've got the rebels, you've got the Russians also. I've got a question here from Malik Zarbat Khan on Facebook Live, who asks, who is going to decide the future of Syria? Will it be the Syrian government, or will it be these other players?
Well, I think it's an illusion to think that any one single player can decide what's going on in Syria. Syria is it's a world war. It's small, right? It's a typical 21st century world war. A lot of state actors dealing with a lot of non-state actors. The non-state actors are the ones that are fighting, except for some of the Assad regime forces. And those in the background, the sponsors are mostly states who are sponsoring those people who are fighting on the ground. So who's going to decide the outcome? It's going to be obviously the coalition of Russia, Iran, and the Syrian regime. And then there is going to be Turkey, which is a player on its own. There is the Gulf countries, the Arab Gulf countries, which are to a certain degree have less influence. And then obviously the West to a certain degree, which has, I would argue, the least of all cards to play.
But the question though now is, if the Syrian government forces decide to take their battle elsewhere, to Idlib, where the rebels still have a strong presence, will the Russians continue to support them? Or has Russia achieved what it wanted to achieve in Syria and wants to end the war now, as far as it's concerned?
Well, I'm very hesitant to say that this is going to be the end of the war. I think the war is going to continue, but we're going to see a lot less motion. So I think it's going to get a lot more static. So those people who are in Idlib province, the FSA and other opposition groups will stay there. And it will be made very difficult for them to actually go back into Aleppo. They're lying in mines at the moment. They're trying to fortify the lines of defense at the moment. And then Turkey's obviously going to keep the areas that they have captured, and the Russians can be happy with what they have achieved so far. Aleppo was the big prize to win before Christmas, and it seems like they've almost achieved it now. So I think the Russians will not push further into Idlib, but there are some commentators who are saying they might push further into Idlib. I don't think it's necessary, and it's going to be more costly than what they're doing now, what they've done so far.
You know, the recurrent comment that we've been getting from our viewers, Andreas, on Facebook Live, on Twitter, is where are the so-called superpowers? Where is the United Nations? Where does this victory, this seemingly victory for Aleppo, it looks like anyway they're going to be victorious there for the Syrian government, where does this leave them, the US, for instance? And also, what can the United Nations do, if anything at all? We heard the war of words yesterday between the different ambassadors at the Security Council. Can the UN actually intervene?
No. I mean, the UN is, we're talking about the international community, and then this kind of presupposes or suggests that there is such a thing as the international community. I would say the international community as a community doesn't exist anymore, because we don't have common values. We've seen in the Security Council, the P5 cannot agree and find any consensus on what's going on in Syria. And I think this is the key problem. The international community is so apart that they will not come to any conclusion. And obviously the United Nations itself is only as good as its member states, is only as powerful as those people in the P5. So as powerful as Russia and the Americans want them to be, as China wants them to be. And we see clearly Russia is not going to back down, and there's nothing the Americans are going to do and can do, because they don't have the resources, they don't have the willpower to do anything.
One last question, Andreas, before we let you go. What is it that happened to change the situation so dramatically? in Aleppo and in the rest of Syria. I mean, the rebels had a firm grip on Aleppo for much of the last 4 years. What was it that changed? Is it just down to Russian support for the Syrian government forces, or is it perhaps the rebels losing some of the support that they've had from the other powers, the outside powers?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, clearly the air power support was the one key aspect that was the game changer, Russian air power. And at the same time, the West unable or unwilling to provide anti-aircraft support to those rebels. On the other hand, the rebels themselves are very factionalized. The factionalization that we've seen, if you look at 2012, the Free Syrian Army was quite a consistent, quite comprehensive entity. Today, we've seen it's a rickrack of different rebel groups, even bigger groups such as Ahrar al-Sham last week split up. So there are these two things at play here. On the one hand, the opposition, very weak, and the Syrian government being supported by the Russians and Iranian proxies. And I think both of this kind of was a game changer.
Thank you very much for your insight, Andreas. Andreas Krieg is a security and military analyst joining us here on the Newsgrid. Lots of questions and comments.